Hi everyone. This is another video in the series on alternatives to the Unity game engine, and this one might be coming out of left field a little bit, but I wanted to talk about mobile games, and specifically games that have fairly low graphical requirements. Unity is capable of producing a lot of different types of games, from 3D shooters on desktop to hyper, mega, uber casual games on mobile. And if you're making a game in that latter category, you may not need the power of some of these game engines. Maybe you'd like to work on a game like 2048 or Wordle, a puzzle game, a word game, something that has very simple graphical user interface requirements. Well, I wanted to talk about .NET MAUI as a potential for that type of project. .NET MAUI is a cross-platform app development framework that's built on C#, so it might be a little more familiar to folks coming from Unity. As I understand it, it's sort of an evolution of Xamarin and Xamarin Forms, but it's a relatively newer project, so I really don't know the state of it and if it's ready for prime time or not. If you're experienced with .NET MAUI, let me know in the comments if this thing is ready to go. Also, the source code for .NET MAUI is released under the MIT license, and I'll leave a link to the GitHub repository in the description of this video. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to create a project that's a proof of concept of a simple grid-based 2D puzzle game. So it could be a word search or something like that. I installed Visual Studio 2022 with the support for .NET MAUI. So when I create a new project, I'm presented with that template. I'll hit next. Name my project. I'm going to select .NET 7. Okay, and now the project is created, and I'm in Visual Studio, and I can see that I've got my project over here on the right, and I have some options here for testing the project. So you can see next to the play button, I have Windows machine selected. That's the default. But there are some other options here for emulators, Android emulators, iOS, etc. I did attempt to use the Android emulator before, and it blue screened my system twice, so I'm probably not going to do that a lot. Again, maybe that's something to do with my configuration. I'm not sure. But I'll use Windows Machine for now to test it, and then I'll show how to build an Android build later. So let's go ahead and hit that button. So now my project is running, and you can see some of the sample content that they include, such as an image, some text, and a button that, when you click it, increments a counter. And there's a banner up top here. One of the features of .NET MAUI is that when you have this app running here, you can make changes in Visual Studio and see them update live. So let's go ahead and try that. We have a few different files here in our project. We have a C# file that's the main starting point for the program, and then we have a few different XAML files. And if you're not familiar with XAML, it's an XML-based user interface definition, domain-specific language. If I click into mainpage.xaml, you can see several things, such as a scroll view, a stack layout, and then here are those sample pieces that they put in, like this image, the label for Hello World, and the button down here. So if I go ahead and modify Hello World, as I'm typing, it's showing up over in this view, even before I've saved this. So that's kind of nice for making changes on the fly. But one thing I want to do is get back to square one. So I'm going to remove the content here in this XAML file. Get rid of the button, the label. You can see it disappear live. And then this image. So I still have a vertical stack layout and a scroll view. I'm actually going to toast those two. And I've just got my content page. You can see that there's still this home banner up here, and that's actually located in the app shell XAML file. So you can do a couple things to get rid of that. You can set the title to empty, which will still have the banner, but no text there. And there's also an option here in this parent node. So it's Yeah, navbar is visible equals false. When I do that, then I've got a completely blank project. Okay, now what I'm going to do is create a grid that could be the basis for a puzzle game, like let's say a word search, a 4x4 grid of random letters where you try to find words in them. So let's go ahead and switch back to the main page XAML. And within here, I can create a grid. And the grid, if you look at the definition here, is a type of layout. There are other types of layouts. There's a vertical stack layout, and there's some analogous concepts in Unity in their user interface system where you can have horizontal, vertical, or grid-based layouts. Those things exist here in MAUI as well. Within that grid, I can place elements like buttons. So I will create a button here. And when I do that, the button is actually by default taking up the majority of, or the entirety of the window. And if I create additional buttons, it's actually still not showing multiple buttons. And what I can do here is provide some definition of how many rows, how many columns I'd like. And the way I can do that is with another element that's a child of the grid node. I've got column definitions, and then I have row definitions as well. So column definition, I can specify a width, and I believe this is in a device independent unit. So I've added 3 columns, but I'm still seeing that there's just one singular button. And what you need to do in the button children is specify which column your element belongs to. You know, you can span columns and rows as well. So this should be familiar to folks who've used HTML and CSS. Okay, so I do have here then the 3 columns, and I can start specifying rows as well. Now, one thing I'll demonstrate in a moment is how to create all of this programmatically so you don't have to replicate a lot of different repetitive elements here. Let's say you wanted to dynamically have a different sized grid at runtime. So I'll show how to do that in a moment. Okay, but first let's do row definitions. It's going to follow a similar format, grid.row definitions. And here I can specify a height instead of a width. And I will need to specify the row on each of these buttons as well. So I'm going to leave the column here. Now I'm going to do grid.row equals 1. And then up here, grid.row equals 0. And now I have 2 rows and 3 columns in my grid. You'll notice that the grid is oriented in the upper left. To change that, I can modify this grid parent here. Horizontal options set to center, and that centers it. And then vertical options set to center as well. And those who've worked with HTML and CSS know that vertical centering can be fun and just you can see that it's a little bit offset from the center vertically, and that's because I've defined 3 rows here, but I only have elements in 2 rows. So if I add some elements that are in that 3rd row, then it'll be perfectly centered. Also, just to show a little bit about the styling of a .NET MAUI app, I'm going to go into a file called styles.xaml. And here I can specify some global styles for my different elements. So in the button node, I can specify if I want a different corner radius, for instance, which I want these a little more rounded. So I'll go ahead and modify this, change that to 20, and all right, they're a little more rounded. I'd also like a little more spacing between the buttons in my grid. So I'll head back here, and in this grid parent, I could specify row spacing. I could specify column spacing. And so I've got a little more white space there. Okay, now that we've manually created a grid, I'm going to show how you can do that programmatically. So I'll delete the buttons that we have present right now, and then we'll switch over to the C# code to show how to instantiate a grid at runtime. So we have, in addition to this MAUI program.cs, which is just the basis of running this app, there's some code behind underneath all of the XAML files. So if I look at mainpage.xaml, there's a C# file underneath it here. And this has some of the sample code that the project is generated with, such as this onClick handler for that counter button. You can see that there's a warning here just because I had deleted the content inside the XAML file, so there's nothing to refer to here. So I'm going to just get rid of this. I have a constructor for this main page class, and inside of it I can add some code that will execute when the app starts. So I'm going to loop through some rows. Let's say I want to have 4 rows. You can notice some of the autocomplete functionality here, which continues to be updated in Visual Studio. So now that I've put in a for loop for rows, it's anticipating that I might want to do the same for columns. I do indeed. And so I just type tab and that will complete that line for me. I create a method here called createButton with row and column. Actually, it anticipated I was going to do that as well. So generate that method. And okay, so I'm creating a new button object here. I'll add some initializers there in a moment. But what I'm going to do is I want to add this to the grid itself at this point. And to do that, I need to reference the grid by name. The grid currently doesn't have a name that I can reference inside of C#. So I can use this x name. Call it button grid. Now when I'm in here, I can utilize button grid, and I'm going to add, I'm actually going to add that new button. So I just have to hit tab. Pretty sweet. I'm going to configure some sample text on that button. And I'm also going to set the column and the row for the button, and I do that via the grid. Set the column of the new button to the column that was passed in. Visual Studio anticipates that. Set row. See if it anticipates. Yep, new button and row. There we go. Now that's still not showing up. Let's just double check if I need to re-execute this. Okay, there we go. I did need to reload that Windows build. So I've got my, let's see, 0 to 4, column plus plus. So one of the reasons that I'm not actually seeing the 4 columns and the 4 rows is because I need to go back and specify, the column definitions. Now, you can do this programmatically as well. So there we go. There's my column, my 4x4 grid. And the next thing I want to do is show a random letter on these buttons. Let's say this was a word search game. So I'll do that in the text. And I can do new random dot next. Oops. This is going to be similar to Unity's random methods. And because that second one is exclusive, I'm going to add one to Z. And that's not working because I need to. This is going to be a character, and then the whole thing needs to go to a string. Okay. That might need a reload as well. Okay, there we go. I've got my grid full of letters. I kind of want to change the color of these buttons and the size of the font. So I'm going to go to colors.xaml. I'm going to set my primary color to something a little more neutral. And then I'm going to change the font size in the buttons here. So font size is 14. Just pick something higher. Yeah, that's fine. Nothing happens when I click the buttons, so I'm going to demonstrate how to add a click handler to this. So in this create button method, I can reference the new button, and there is a pressed handler. They have a pressed and click handler, so click handler will, at least in this Windows build, will be when I press the button and then release. I want something where I'm just doing that sort of press and add an event handler there. So I'm going to add something, button pressed. Okay, and then what I need to do is create that method, and it'll pass in the button that was pressed. So I'm actually going to say, I want the button. That is really nice. I mean, look at that. It's got, it knows what I want to do. So I can cast it like that. I can also cast it like this. And what I want to do now is give a little bit of an animation to the button when you press it. And so there are a couple functions you can do for that. I'm gonna do a little kind of bounce. So I want to change the scale slightly in this method. Now I'm gonna need to do this asynchronously, so I'll write this code and then I'll show you how to modify it so that it's asynchronous. So we'll do a scale 2, and the scale of my button should be 1. So I'm gonna go down to a little bit lower than that, 0.6. Unit length, I think, yeah, so that's in milliseconds. So over 50 milliseconds, I want to translate the scale from 1 to 0.6. And then I can specify an easing function. For this one, it's going to be linear. So I'm going to go linearly down from 1 to 0.6 in 50 milliseconds. And then I want to kind of pop back. So I'm going to pop back to scale 1, and I'm going to do that a little slower, 500 milliseconds. And for that easing function, I'm going to choose the spring out method. Or, I'm sorry, the spring out easing function. So overshoots and then returns. There on the .NET MAUI documentation pages, there are some graphs of what that looks like. But if I execute this code now without making it asynchronous. We'll see what happens. So I click it and nothing happens. What I want to do instead is to make this an async method. And then I want to await these items. And you can see it's warning me about that. Because this call is not awaited, execution of the current method continues before the call is completed. Consider applying the await operator. I've considered it, and I'm going to do it. All right, let's run it again. Okay. Now when I click it, you can see the button kind of bounces, and I can have multiple buttons in that state as well. So there you go. That is kind of a basic .NET MAUI app for really simple puzzle style games. Let me know in the comments if you've used this tool before and your opinions of it. And the last thing I want to show is how to turn this into a mobile build. If I look inside my project folder in Windows Explorer, I have a bin folder and a debug folder, since that's what I've been building. There are a few different subfolders here for different environments. Inside Windows 10, which is what I'm running on this machine, there is an exe for that program I was building. And if I come back here to Android, don't really have anything that I can run on Android yet. So let's go back to our project settings. So if I right click and select properties on my grid test project here, I've got under application the different targets, Windows, Android, and iOS. And under Android targets, I can specify the minimum framework that I'd like to target, and then just the target in general. Select this one. And then when I do that, I can use the .NET publish command on the command line. So I'll go over here to Developer PowerShell. Make sure everything is saved here. Okay, and all right, I can use .NET publish. I'm going to specify the framework flag -f. And when I do this, I need to create a string here that is related to the .NET runtime. So I'll do 7.0 -Android 33.0. Let's see if that works. I'm going to specify a configuration with -C of release. So my build completed, and now when I browse to my project directory in Windows Explorer, and I go into the bin folder and release, I can see that I have an Android subfolder, and I have an APK file and an app bundle, so I can run this on a real device. Okay, that's it for now on .NET MAUI. It's just one of many different non-game related app development frameworks that you can use. If you're more comfortable with JavaScript, React Native is very popular. So just another option to keep in our tool belt. Thanks to everyone that participated in the poll that I posted. Based on the results, it looks like I'm going to take a look at GameMaker next. So stay tuned for that. Have a great day.